It is the idea that the subject or the author, because he is uncategorizable, which is to say unequal to anything, therefore he must be stripped from the status of being and reality, and then rejected from consideration of object. What must be of consideration for the purpose of reference is not the subject but the object minus that subject. What is important, libertarians tell us, is not the worker, but the work in itself, without reference to who has performed the work. But does such a work exist in reality? Are not the workers, the authors of work themselves, reality? What is a book without the author? Can there be such a thing as authorless book? Libertarians told us there can. Is work in abstract really an actual object of compensation? Following this line of libertarian logic, the man should be judged based not on those things which are non-changeable, read unequal, such as his birth of lineage, or his family, or his people, or his looks, or his social status and history, but rather on the basis of whatever else, say, the so-called achievement. That is to say, on the basis of those things which liberals thought could at least hypothetically be equal, that is, non-evolving. What could be fairer than that? Nothing, until you realize that to exclude the subject, the author is to exclude reality. This does not go without consequences to you, the rejecter, which is wholesale denial of the status of reality to people in space and time. To deny the king the status of person is to deny the subjects the status of people in the final consequence, since these people are now completed, not by the idea of king the person, but by the idea of idea called human being. Person was replaced with principle, told us democracy, in order to pursue supremacy of hell over heaven. The achievement and merit was postulated by liberals and libertarians for the explicit purpose of replacing all of the above, that is, replacing that which naturalism regards as non-changing, namely one's status or one's particular identity. The motivation of libertarianism to reward good behavior and punish bad behavior was not Christian morality, as it was assumed at the start, but rather liberalism, which is the removing out of existence that which liberalism regards as non-changeable, namely the so-called limits and barriers to access, such as king's superiority over his subjects. Another example of such limit was the man of the house, which is to say, the man's supervising or heading the affairs of the family over woman, was misconstrued by the liberals as limit. It is a limit on truth if truth does not include lies. Such truth is just partial truth, a limited truth, or not the whole truth. The whole truth would deny reality to the distinction between truth and lie. By the same liberal logic, light is limited if it does not include darkness. Distinctions and inequalities are roughly the same things. Libertarians were quick to give standing ovation to these liberal arguments, which assume that those fixed distinctions in life are not life itself, but limits which enslave us, and we must emancipate ourselves from them. Light must emancipate itself from the toluene of being light without darkness in it. The distinction between light and darkness can be regarded as shining or superiority, but since the false language of naturalism is unable to find concept for shining or superiority of light over and through darkness, it regards shining as ideology rather than as reality in itself. We must be more vigilant than libertarianism and remember that what is precisely in question is whether work, merit, or performance without the performer is an actual performance and not rather some idea or an attempted concept of performance within the attempted theory or ideology of naturalism, which does not exist in reality. In reality, there is performance authored by the performer. Just because the authorship is unequal or non-categorizable, that in no way negates the absolute reality and objectivity of the authorship. For libertarianism to ignore that is to turn away from reality and to refer to ideas as if those were references to reality. That is the origin of the libertarian theme wired into our mind, which maintains that we must judge people based on the so-called work, conduct, action, performance, rather than based on particular person. And why not? Well, because the so-called object, that is, work, conduct, action, performance, or merit, can be thought as instances of categories or concepts, and so it is at least theoretically possible for them to be equal. That is to say, a hierarchical. Subject or person, on the other hand, because he is uniquely unique, therefore he is representation of inequality, as something which naturalism cannot regard as possible to categorize, to bring under law, so as to embed it successfully into larger ideology of naturalism. So, libertarianism helped us deeper down the abyss by pushing us to exclude the subject, the person, the author of those actions and performances, so as to be consistent with naturalism. The answer can only be this. Work minus the worker is not work, but just an attempted idea of work that libertarians compensate. Ideas of work do not exist in reality. In reality, we only have particular worker doing the work. Why should we exclude the author from reality when in reality the first thing that is important and matters to us is the author, and only later his work? Liberalism reverses the order of subject and object, privileging as a result the idea of object over the idea of subject. So why exclude the author? Why reject the cornerstone? Well, libertarians, being liberals, tell us that it is because the distance or the relation between a worker and his work is limit or ideology, since that distance or that relation cannot be brought under a category or concept or principle or law or idea. Therefore, it is not real. But why would it be necessary to bring reality under ideas? Why would it be moral to reduce reality to ideology? Can naturalism answer that? Likewise, what is precisely in question is whether people minus the king are in fact people, especially from the vantage point of time. What is in question is whether man minus his birth, his lineage or his family, his ancestors, his race, his entire people, and his social status is still a man, and not rather some abstract idea or concept or placeholder for ideas called individual or human being in place of actual people existing in time and place throughout history. Such man is not a man at all, not without the so-called secondary qualities of rationalists. That is, without the so-called inequalities which liberalism outlaws as pollutions, yet which situate him in reality and make him who he actually is, a particular man, in particular place, at particular time, with particular state of mind, a living being whom God actually created. That, however, is exactly what naturalism and natural science seek to eradicate from existence and reference to reality, namely particularity, locality, perspective, distinctions, identities, and therefore the truth as reflection of reality. These so-called inequalities are not inequalities, since they are inequalities only within and according to naturalism. Naturalism as such is not referring to man's birth, or his family, or his people, but to the attempted concepts within naturalism. Concept of that man's birth and concept of his family, the concept of his people, or concept of race. Concepts are simply ideas, not reality. So naturalism is not speaking about reality or real things, real peoples, real races, but about ideas of races, completed, as it were, by another metaphysical idea called human being. And when it fails to find categories for the distinctions between these real identities, it concludes that since there are no categories for the distinctions between ideas, therefore the distinctions between real things and identities are not real, as if distinctions required categories or concepts in order to be real, and as if liberalism was referring to reality of identities and not to their attempted concepts. Liberals rejecting the king said that in place of the king, In place of the person, they want principle. They want law to rule and to govern them, thereby displacing a being with idea as the way of man's life and guidance. Liberals did not have a problem with kings and principle. Rather, they had a problem with someone other than them being the ruler, the king, namely reality outside them. Consequently, liberals called for constitution as a commitment to complete the separation from truth and reality, typified by hierarchies of reality. That very constitution in practice and principle, however, is trespassing on these postulated people, stripping them over time from those secondary qualities, that is, from their very personhood, from their particular characteristics. Read, unequal, non-changing characteristics, such as that of being a particular people at particular place and particular time, with particular conscience, particular faith and sight, the exercise of which now under liberalism and republicanism becomes punishable under law. Those so-called unequal characteristics, or the secondary qualities, are interpreted by liberalism as limits, the same limits that allegedly limited the subjects of the king. Liberal solution was to replace the king with law, the coercive law, which now treats those ex-subjects as properties or subjects of the law, which, unlike the king, is depriving those subjects of every single characteristic which makes them the people they are. Liberalism is dehumanism and mistreatment of the people. King was not telling his subjects that their sexes or races are not real, but the Constitution completed by the incompleteness, namely the pseudo-idea of human being, is doing just that, denying people personhood. Liberals tell us without embarrassment that we are a nation not of men, but of laws. Outside of liberalism, however, we are a nation of men, and not of laws authored by other laws. These liberal laws are not laws, since they are completed by the ideology of naturalism, and as such, they are not real laws for the people, actually existing as they exist, but for the benefit of the attempted concept of people within naturalism. Laws, supposed to be completed by the author of laws, who is a person or a being such as the American Christian people, not by the ideology of naturalism formed of the ideology of environmentalism and humanism. Outside of naturalism, the U.S. Constitution is completed by the authors of the Constitution, namely particular historical people of the time and place, by Christians, not by idea of human being, authored by the ideologies of humanism, then environmentalism, and finally naturalism. What benefit could there be for the authors of the Constitution to set the Constitution against themselves, like naturalism through liberalism implies they did? The Americans who established the American Constitution saw themselves as Christians first and foremost, as people under Christian God, completing the U.S. Constitution. The Christian people, not the humanist concept of human being, completed the Constitution. As long as it was remembered that the people, rather than idea, completed the Constitution, the people were able to preserve their existence and conserve the identity of their people. When the ideology of humanism was pushed against Christian faith in order to displace Christian identity with the idea of human being so as to replace the authors of the Constitution, then the door of the house was open for destruction through subordinating the American people under the foreign concept. Concepts and ideas were privileged over the people. Democracy is supremacy of ideology over reality, elevating itself over and above the reality of the relation between the king and the subjects. The conservative movement, likewise located within naturalism, saw man's government as an exercise of moral power, and so historically, they defended monarchies rather than constitutions. They knew the relation between the king and the subject, as well as the relation between every other hierarchy in life, is not a limit but opportunity, and life itself. The conservatives were able to see that, since they were not informed by the ideology of naturalism, but by the spirit of truth from God. For the preservation of a healthy diversity in any civilization, there must exist orders, classes, differences, and material conditions. They are the reality in itself. Reductionism of reality to ideology is not in the interest of life of anyone. It can only be recognized outside of the ideology that Christian faith is the civilizing agent that gives men their one stable way of life, making them aware of their particular obligations as well as answering the questions, who am I and what am I to do? How am I to take steps of life? Liberal revolutionaries, on the other hand, forsook the experience and wisdom of the past, trusting only their inclinations, and now exist for no other reason but uprooting whatever authority exists at the moment and plunging the moment in history into anarchy. Confrontation with reality is what they cannot accept, so they seek its downfall. It